Order. Welcome to this morning's session of the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Select Committee for our first session back following the summer recess, where we will be considering the impact of the state of the economy on business, workers and consumers. The first panel this morning, we're delighted to welcome four witnesses. Dame Clare Moriarty from the Citizens Advice, Torsten Bell, Chief Executive of the Resolution Foundation, Tom Walters from the IFS, and Joanne Cairns from the trade union Usdaw. Good morning to all of you. Just to kick us off, I'm going to come to the two economists in the room. The Bank of England painted a pretty dire picture a few weeks ago about the state of the economy and impending recession. Do you agree, Torsten Bell?
It's quite hard to avoid a recession in Europe now, given the scale of the energy price rises that we're seeing. There's obviously quite a high uncertainty about the duration and the depth of that, and the most important determinant of that is what exactly happens to gas prices, both at the wholesale level, where you'll have seen all the very high volatility in recent days. Anyone looking at an individual day's worth of data on energy prices should be cautious at the moment. But yeah, I think they are broadly right to be painting a pretty grim picture. Their picture is significantly grimmer than the Office for Budget Responsibility's forecasts, particularly on the labour market a few months before that. But I don't think it's unreasonable. And obviously, since then, we've had a mixture of generally bad news, particularly on what the inflation outlook might look like. Obviously, their policy, their forecast didn't take into account any more support from government, and it's now very likely that we'll be seeing that in the coming days, and that it'll be very significant indeed. So I think that's very important. That matters partly, obviously, for what it does to household incomes. So, a package of measures which provides very significant support could see us move from a situation where household incomes are falling very significantly this year, 5%, to one where there's almost no fall. So I think that is really important to bear in mind. And then obviously how much of that support passes through to businesses, and how much the way in which one of the reasons we're getting a recession is obviously that household spending falling because of rising energy prices, but it's also the way in which we ration energy usage is by people stopping activity in the business sector, and that is how you get one of the reasons you get a recession as well. So it is really important what happens on the household side, but also on the business side.
Do you think that we can avoid a recession if the scale of the package on energy is big enough?
I think you'd be optimistic to be very confident that you can avoid a recession given what's happening to Europe.
Okay, Tom Walters, do you agree?
I don't think I have too much to add to that. I would say, when you're seeing inflation hit 10% and even higher than that, earnings obviously not keeping up with that, people's incomes aren't keeping up with it, and so you'd expect that to feed through to consumer spending, and with that kind of decline in real household income, it's difficult to really see how you could avoid a pretty significant hit to the economy.
Okay, thank you. Mark Pawsey.
I'm just wondering if I can follow on what Torsten and Tom said with an international comparison. You both referred to Europe and the impact of high energy prices in Europe, but we're shifting where we're focusing our trade away from Europe to other parts of the world. So is there a possibility that we might be less severely affected by trading with the US and other countries where they may be not so severely affected?
No. I mean, let's be honest.
Why not?
Because that isn't what's happening. I mean, if you look at our trade data, the interesting thing, which was wrong from the predictions by those that were in favour of Brexit and those that were opposed to Brexit, is rather than seeing what we expected to see, which is really differential effects on our trade with Europe versus our trade with the rest of the world, overall what we've just seen is that Britain is becoming a less open economy and doing less trading, full stop. And so you're not getting the kind of differential effect that you're implying, plus the changes would be too small to give us that kind of thing. So the big things that matter, this isn't a trade-driven shock, so the big things that are going on here is obviously gas prices being particularly elevated in Europe, and that's why Europe's likely to enter a recession ahead of the US. And I think it's really important that the dynamics here and in the United States are distinct. But remember, the Fed in the US is basically telling people that they're going to need to cause a recession to get inflation under control for different reasons to the inflation we're seeing because of what's going on in the labour market there. So I think you shouldn't take too much confidence from hoping that, okay, Europe's bad, but the rest of the world is going to be okay, not least because Europe's obviously our biggest
But is the rest of the world okay?
Well, I mean, if you know, look what's happening in China. We're still trying to run a zero COVID policy, which is requiring shutting down large parts of economic activity, even if they can get the gas to do it. So, no, it's not okay.
So Tom, we're all in this together. The entire world is facing a pretty negative outlook.
Yeah, I'd say, one important way that Europe does play into it is that several countries are trying to subsidise gas prices, and so that has knock-on effects to the UK in the form of, by keeping demand for gas up, that pushes prices up, and so then that spills over to UK consumers who have to pay those higher prices. So I'd say that's at least as significant an effect.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Tonya Antoniazzi.
Thank you, Chair. We know as members of Parliament how the cost of living is hitting our constituents, and I just want to know how you see households are experiencing the cost of living crisis now from your perspective, and how do you expect these trends to develop? So I'm going to start with you, dear Moriarty, if that's okay.
Certainly, yes. And I think we are already seeing a cost of living crisis on the ground. I think it's really important to realise that we are not just talking about things that might happen in October when the energy price cap goes up, but things which are happening now. So we're hearing it from our advisors who are in touch with clients. So the things that are coming through from them, more people are coming to us who are already at crisis point. So they're talking about people coming who have already lost access to gas and electricity and are a day away from running out of food. They're finding that people need food bank vouchers even when they've had all the best advice that we can give them about how to maximise their income and budget. We're seeing people coming with more problems and more complex problems. We're seeing a kind of rise in threatened homelessness, issues with domestic violence, a lot of mental health issues. We're seeing people who are living in impossible situations. So one of our advisors talked about somebody who needs a chairlift, is frightened about using the electricity needed to run the chairlift, so he's contemplating trying to live either on the upper floor or the lower floor, but the kitchen's on one floor and the bathroom's on the other floor. And we're also hearing about people who are coming to Citizens Advice for the first time who would not have expected to need help. So we're seeing a lot of that. So we hear it in the stories of individuals. We also see it in the data that we have. So one very significant thing is that we would normally expect to see a drop in demand in summer. We're not seeing that. We're seeing record levels of people who can't top up prepayment meters in what has been the joint hottest summer ever recorded. So people are not using gas and electricity for heating. We've had over 13,000 people come to us already this year who can't top up prepayment meters. We're helping 2 people every minute with crisis support. That's food bank vouchers and charitable donations. And one of the very striking things we saw when the first tranche of the cost of living payments went out in July, we saw a measurable drop in the number of people needing food bank vouchers. It lasted about 3 weeks, and we're now back up to near record levels. So that's an overall picture of what we're seeing on the ground.
Yeah, some worrying trends then. And I'll go to Joanne. With Usdaw, what are you seeing?
Well, we represent workers across retail, distribution, food manufacturing and pharmaceutical sector. Most of our members work in food retailing supermarkets. So majority of our members are in low-paid employment, and so we're seeing the impact of the cost of living crisis already. We hear it anecdotally from our members, and we also surveyed our members in June, and we found that 1 in 4 of our members told us that they're missing meals every month to pay their bills, which is a dramatic increase since we ran the same survey last year, and we found that it was 1 in 20 then, so it's been a huge increase over the last year. More than 70% of our members tell us that financial worries are affecting their mental health. We also know that that's higher for our members who are parents, so 82% of our members who have children say that financial worries are affecting their mental health. 48% of our members have told us that petrol prices and travel costs actually affect their ability to get to work, so going to work in itself is becoming expensive for people. So, we're extremely concerned, obviously, about the impact on our members' incomes, and going forward, I think one of the big risks is a debt spiral. We already know 75% of our members have already been relying on unsecured borrowing to pay their bills, and of them, more than half are now struggling to keep up with the repayments, and that is clearly only going to get worse. And when we asked our members how they're going to cope with bills increasing further, 30% of our members told us that they just won't use their heating, which is extremely worrying. 62% said that they would significantly cut down on their heating, and 40% said that they'll cut down on other essentials like food. So people are, seriously contemplating having to make the choice between heating and eating over the winter.
I just wanted to ask you this, a different question really. What conversations are you having with the retailers, with big supermarkets, for them to support their employees? Are they putting things in place around food poverty and bills, maybe clothing for children? Do they offer support in that way? Are you seeing any of that increasing maybe, instead of just maybe normal percentage off because you're an employee? Are there any initiatives that you can share with us that are being done by the supermarkets particularly?
There aren't any specific ones in the supermarkets that we deal with that I'm aware of. I mean, we are having conversations with employers regarding, looking for an emergency response to this cost of living emergency. Most of our pay bargaining has already concluded for 2022 because it's tends to be in the first and second quarter because it's around the minimum wage cycle. However, we are having conversations with employers about looking at what can be done in the meantime before the next pay review comes up, and we're having those conversations. I know there was something in the news about John Lewis providing meals for their staff. We're not recognised in John Lewis, but that's something I believe that is one approach employers are taking. Obviously, our main concern is making sure that our members get significant increases in their pay, and also that they get the hours that they need as well, because lots of our members are on short hours contracts and don't have those hours guaranteed, and their hours can fluctuate. So, we want to ensure that our members have secure work as well as better paid work.
That's really important. And going back to the original question then for you, Torsten, about what are you seeing and what trends are going to develop?
Well, the previous two speakers have spoken eloquently about what they're seeing on the ground. I mean, on the big picture, this is an absolutely astronomical hit to household incomes. The country as a whole is getting poorer, and this whole discussion is just about who gets poorer and when. Right. The scale of it in terms of the income falls this year and next year on our projections is that we're on course, again subject to the announcements that happened this week, but we're on course without any further announcements for a 5% income fall this year and a 6% fall next year. Take them together, 10% income fall, we're talking about a hit to household incomes that's twice as bad as that we saw during the financial crisis. So this is totally unprecedented. We haven't seen anything like that in a century, which is why it's inevitable the government will be stepping forward with a very large package of measures this week. I think it's really important to put that in the context, which is that's happening now as a sudden, sharp shock to us on the back of 10, 15 years, really, of slow wage growth, and particularly what you're seeing at the bottom end amongst households, poorer households, is that they are then having to spend more of their budget on essentials. So if we look at the poorest fifth, they've gone from spending just a bit over 50% to almost 60% on essentials over the course of those 15 years as their living standards have been squeezed. That means that when an income shock comes along, which we're going to see that even with the big policy announcements this week, households are going to be getting poorer. They don't have lots of non-essential spending luxuries that they can cut to pay those energy bills. And that context is really worrying. Stepping back then, where would we expect to see the difficulties coming this winter? Well, they're most acute for the 4 million households, which includes 30% of the poorest fifth of households on prepayment meters, because we really are talking about thousands of people are going to be having their energy cut off this winter. And we know thousands of people die every year in winter because of cold homes. I think the last estimate I saw was about 8,500 excess deaths in winter alone in 2019 from cold homes. So this is very serious indeed. And prepayment meter customers generally don't have the flexibility, obviously, to run up arrears. For everybody else, what we are going to see is very large arrears being built up. That's very bad for the people concerned because they will get their credit rating damaged. They may be put onto prepayment meters. But it's also, it's going to cause difficulties for energy suppliers who are going to see their bad debts go through the roof, which is one of the reasons why, obviously, the energy suppliers themselves are very keen to see a package of measures that cuts those costs.
And Tom, would you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the inflation rates we're seeing now is kind of, not seen it in at least 30 years. At the moment, it's tilted somewhat, that it's somewhat higher for poorer households because they tend to spend more on those items like energy, which are particularly going up. But the sort of the slope of that difference, the size of that difference, is set to increase pretty dramatically come the increase in the price cap, if indeed we do have an increase in the price cap. So I do think it is particularly notable that we're seeing these kinds of things on the ground typically for poorer households at a time when there's still quite a lot of road to go before it kind of gets to the worst it's going to get, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, no, I do totally. Just going to you, Clare, how is the cost of living crisis unfolding in different regions of the UK? I know that you have very good data to be able to identify where the issues are. Where are the hot spots for citizens' advice?
Well, I think, the hotspots are effectively related particularly to places where there are people who are on low incomes. So we're seeing it a lot in different types of households. So disabled people are particularly squeezed, partly because they will often have additional costs of energy. If you need to keep medicine in the fridge or if you need to keep equipment on. We know that families are being particularly squeezed, and the flat rate of the cost of living payments meant that they had less impact on that. And we know that energy debts are now the most common type of debt that people are coming to us with. So we're certainly seeing a kind of a regional. Regionally, it very much depends on people's level of income. But as others have said, this is a huge crisis for people on low incomes who simply have. They have nowhere to go, and the rise in prices that's already happened is already causing material problems for people. I think that is the point that I really want to keep making, that people are very, very worried looking ahead to October, and we estimate that at least 1 in 5 people won't be able to pay energy bills in October if nothing is done. We hear the messages about support packages, but actually right now here on the ground we are seeing very large numbers of people who simply cannot keep the lights on and keep food on the table.
And would you be able to specifically give any areas of the country? I know you name them that you have concerns over, where you may be putting extra resources into.
Well, as I say, I think this is essentially a crisis that is most acute for people on low incomes. So parts of the country, and we know that the income distribution is quite uneven across the country. So we know that in areas of deprivation. So I was quite recently with our local assistance advice in Blackpool, which is one of the most deprived areas of the country, and they are seeing significant numbers of people coming to them who haven't eaten for a day. So those parts of the country which have the highest levels of deprivation and the lowest levels of income are definitely where support needs to be targeted most.
Yeah, Torsten, I was going to come to you next. Actually,
well, I don't have. There's a very important question about on the micro level and within regions you will see huge variation. And actually I think one thing that's underestimated in this discussion is the large amount of variation even amongst people of similar incomes in similar areas, because the size of your family, the nature of your house is really important. So I think it is hard. This is happening right across the UK. The one area that isn't getting anywhere near enough discussion but is totally different is Northern Ireland. Okay, and it's a disgraceful lack of discussion of what is happening in Northern Ireland. Remember, Ofgem doesn't cover Northern Ireland. There is no price cap. And it's also a totally different heating system where 68% of households are heated by oil. Okay, so their price went up in February last year, hugely, even before gas started going through the roof. No one's been discussing it. And it's not just, I think it's only 24% of Northern Irish houses are on gas, obviously, and maybe in the cities. In general, the Northern Ireland housing stock is also more energy hungry because it's more detached houses, fewer flats in city centres. And there isn't a functioning executive, and you need a functioning executive because that's how we distribute the £400 payment, for example. So I think we should be putting much more up in lights what's happening in Northern Ireland. They've been suffering through this problem well ahead of the rest of the country.
Yeah, and basically my next question was going to be to you and also to Clare. What does this mean about levelling up? How is this, what does this mean for the levelling up agenda? I mean, talking about Northern Ireland, they're missing out. What about other parts of the country?
I mean, I think it is important to recognise that overall this is a catastrophe for the whole country, and I have seen discussions, about some parts of the country saying we have a lot of renewables, so why are we paying this price and the others? I think that's slightly missing the point. Okay, what's happening is that the country as a whole is poorer in the world because we're seeing a redistribution away from energy importing countries and towards energy exporting countries. Maybe we'll come back to Norway later, but that's the big picture. We're getting poorer. I think the crucial thing is the point Claire's raising, which is we've then got to make decisions as a country about how we deal with that. And the top priority is protecting those on lower incomes who exist in every part of our country from that. And then more broadly, we're making a decision about how much of those costs we want to pay up front and how much we want to pay in future years and how we do that. So the levelling up agenda is to do with very long-term trends, to do with differences in income levels that have been with us for some time. This is making that harder because the poorer places will be harder hit because they have more poorer households in them, but everybody is going to be hit by what is going on. It does have... I think that's what's more important is that we don't accidentally choose policy solutions which only help some parts of the country. So I'll give you an example. If your main policy answer is to cut national insurance rates, you will see twice as much benefit going to London, the average Londoner, as you do to the average... Actually, it's more than twice. The average household in the northeast of England. But energy bills are going to be going up in the northeast of England as they're going up in London and the southeast. So our focus on making sure that you don't leave people out and the right kind of people out would be my top lesson. On levelling up, that's a much bigger conversation. This isn't making anything in Britain easier. I mean, becoming poor as a country makes everything we need to achieve harder. But that's why it's really important we get the right answers to how we do that.
Okay. Tom, what areas? I mean, we've talked about which areas of the economy people are, consumers are cutting back on. But will certain sectors of the economy face particular risk as a result of a collapse in discretionary spending?
Yeah, so food retailers, supermarkets are already reporting they're seeing fewer people. They're seeing lower quantities in spending there and a move away towards kind of cheaper supermarkets as well. Also seeing the hospitality sector as well, people sort of moving from sort of more mid-range restaurants and so on down to cheaper ones. And so I suppose it's those sorts of areas where you might expect people to cut back. Both those where I guess two ways to think about it. One is where the costs are going up because they use a lot of energy in their inputs to produce the goods and services they sell, and then other ones where it's more kind of discretionary, slightly more luxury spending, where consumers might cut back if they're feeling the pinch.
Okay, Torsten, have you got anything to add?
No, I don't have a lot to add on that. I mean, as I say, what is going to happen amongst higher income households, if we see anything like this, is that they go on far fewer and cheaper holidays, right? That's what we learned from the pandemic, is that how richer households adjust to big shocks is that they spend a lot on holidays broadly defined, okay, like short holidays, hotels, and they will see big falls in their consumption, I'd have thought, on that over the course of the next year. And then I think the immediate areas you're going to see are the things that Tom's basically broadly mentioned. The hospitality sector is going to have a very, very, very tough few months coming up.
Yeah, and Joanne, from your perspective, Usdaw?
Yeah, I mean, we're obviously concerned about the impact on the retail sector. The combination of increasing prices for retailers along with consumer spending power being squeezed. We did see, although retail sales increased slightly over the summer, retailers are reporting that discretionary items and clothing, those sort of things, people are already starting to cut back on. The retail sector is still recovering from the pandemic, was hit, particularly non-food retail, was hit very hard by the pandemic. So clearly there needs to be support for the sector, and in particular there needs to be a review of business rates and support around that.
Thanks, Joanne. And to finish with you, Claire, have you got anything to add?
I think we are less focused on the sectors of the economy. We're particularly focused on the impact on individuals. But obviously, one of the consequences of particular sectors being hit is the potential for unemployment, and which further stresses people's financial position.
Yeah,
Thank you. Andy MacDonald, please.
Thanks, Chair. Can I turn the panel's attention to working conditions and pay, and perhaps if I could ask Joanne, Torsten and Tom to answer these questions. Well, we already know that we've got 3.7 million people in insecure work as we stand, but how do you think working conditions and pay are going to be affected by this crisis, and how widespread do you think we're going to see industrial action across the country? Joanne?
Well, I mean, this crisis is clearly being caused by a combination of rising costs and low wages. Real value of wages is down to 6.2% on the latest RPI figures, which is the worst fall since current records began in 2000, and is expected to get worse. So as living standards are hit and real pay continues to be eroded, we are still seeing rising profits in a number of companies as well. So it's hardly surprising that workers who are struggling to make ends meet are then, put in a position where they have to consider all the options to protect their pay and conditions. A lot of these workers are key workers and worked throughout the pandemic and have, their contribution should be recognised. So, yeah, it's likely that industrial disputes are going to continue to be prominent in many sectors of the economy. And, that's likely to continue. There isn't... we're in the longest wage squeeze for 200 years, and, prices are continuing to rise, and incomes are not rising at the same rate. I mean, I think the current median basic pay award is 3.74%, so we're not seeing pay increases that are matching inflation or anywhere near.
So there's a number of things that speak to that. I mean, so overall we're obviously in a slightly weird world where we're seeing, depending on how you want to measure it, but we're seeing historically very large falls in real wages at a time when we're seeing respectable nominal pay rises given what we've been used to over the course of the last 20 years. So we're getting to kind of 5% nominal. I think what we're seeing settling at is the employers settling in around, I'll come back to the public sector in a second, but in most employers we're settling around 5% nominal pay awards happening this year, and obviously inflation's running at double that. So we're combining fast compared to what we were seeing before the pandemic nominal pay rises with very big falls in real pay. In terms of in the public-private sector, that is very distinct, obviously, with much bigger falls in the public sector because the nominal pay growth is much weaker. Some of that may be a lag in terms of, the public sector is now realising it needs to move towards that 5% level, which is why schools and others are being told to suck up the costs of that at the moment, which will in turn have big knock-on effects to the costs of running those public services. But broadly, we're seeing the public sector taking much more of the pain right now. On industrial action, I mean, look, there's two things to say. One is, obviously, we're seeing much more than we are used to. I think we need to grow up a bit. I mean, look, we're seeing a huge inflation shock. There is going to be a discussion about who bears the pain of that inflation shock, okay? And you're going to get industrial action as we work out. We're not used to seeing, as a country, power discussions that hit quickly in terms of who gets what, okay? And we've just got one, because that's what an inflation shock that's driven by a terms of trade shock is. It's who's going to bear the pain of this. Will it be companies? Will it be employers? Will it be owners? Where does it sit? That is what is playing out over the course of this 18 months. Within that, it's blindingly obvious that you're going to see a significant elevation in industrial action, admittedly concentrated in the handful of sectors that happen to still have large unionisations, but you'll see worker pressure that doesn't manifest itself as industrial action in sectors that don't have large union presences. That is totally unavoidable. We need to stop making that as if it's some kind of pathology. That is what an energy crisis does to you, and it's not going to go away until the energy crisis goes away. Similarly, the same logic takes you to the conclusion that in the end, workers aren't going to get inflation level pay rises because we're all getting poorer as a country. And so we are having a discussion about who is getting poorer, where, and what the balance and when it happens. So I think we should just expect industrial relations to be more difficult until this problem eases. And,
But Torsten, you've said that the nation's getting poorer. there's quite a section of society that is not getting poorer. Dividends are being declared. There's eye-watering executive pay being awarded. Isn't the issue of redistribution of wealth absolutely critical to this now? It's unavoidable.
I think it's very important that we are redistributing to make sure that the poorest households are going to be much hardest hit by what happens this winter are supported. But on your question about is it possible for all workers in the British economy to receive an inflation level pay rise this year and next year? That's not going to happen, right? Now, there's a separate question, which is what do we think is the right long-term level of the rewards to labour and the rewards to capital? And I think that's a really important discussion to have as a country, and that is about worker power in the long run, and that the form of that will take is larger labour market reform over a longer time period. But in terms of what's going to happen this year, that isn't going to happen. We're going to have a discussion, and we're going to workers and employers and individual companies are going to decide the balance of who's bearing that pain. I have seen some things saying, oh look, some people are doing really well out of this crisis. Although I think we should be really specific about who is and who isn't. I don't think it's going to be true, although I have seen some reports alleging this, that we're seeing profit increases generally happening this year. That's not going to be happening. I mean, our problem is going to be if we don't do anything, loads of companies going to the wall. Okay, so profits overall are not going to be going up. We're getting poorer, and that's going to include people that own companies. They're not managing to pass on all the costs to consumers. And so they will be getting poorer, and lots of the things we're talking about as inflation for households will manifest as higher costs for firms. Okay, so what is true is two things where I think you get straight into the distribution issue you're raising. One is if we look at within pay settlements, it is true that we're seeing stronger pay growth at the top, particularly if we focus on the HMRC real-time information data from the PAYE system rather than from the workforce survey. We're definitely seeing higher pay growth there, particularly slightly earlier in the year when bonus season was coming through. You could see that quite strongly if you looked at total pay rather than regular pay. And I think that is maybe as the labour market loosens, that won't continue, but you definitely have seen higher paid workers who all the academic literature shows us have more labour market power, have been able to exercise that during the period of the tight labour market and have seen large bonuses coming through. And I think that that is a problem about who's going to be best placed to deal with this crisis. And it obviously comes on the back of higher income households, which obviously disproportionately have higher earners in them, being the same households that saved more during the pandemic. And they're going to be running down their savings as they go through this crisis, but the bottom third of the population didn't see that increase in savings. The second area is obviously there are some specific kinds of companies that are seeing big windfalls. Okay, and now everyone's focused on the hydrocarbon production, so BP and Shell. We should obviously be windfall taxing those as a case for opening that up further than we've already done. We've gone for a kind of de minimis-ish package. It's time to go further in that space, but there are other parts of the energy sector that are seeing very big windfalls. Anyone that is generating electricity and able to sell that at current spot prices, okay, is not producing it, is priced on the basis of gas generation, but their costs are they're not using gas to produce that electricity, are far lower. That's not something that we can carry on going through this winter, because if we do allow those things to happen, it's going to put much more pressure on the package the government announces on Thursday, because you will either use borrowing to fill the gap that you need to get down retail bills, or you will end up having to go for a bigger long-term drag on energy bills in future, and that is not a good thing to be doing. So I think I'd be very cautious about some of the proposals I'm seeing from bits of the energy companies who are pretending that it's all help today, but really what they're doing is asking us to put up energy bills tomorrow. And windfall taxes is part of the way. Either windfall taxes or regulating down those prices is how we avoid all the pressure going on future generations by bills, because those who are doing well today should be paying.
Yeah, I mean, Torsten said, it's an unusual situation. We have fairly decent nominal pay growth, but negative real pay growth. I think it's also an unusual situation where we have real pay falling pretty considerably, but the labour market is actually very tight in the sense there's a lot of vacancies still out there and unemployment still at a low level. And so it's kind of, in that sense, a situation we're not really very used to. It looks what the Bank of England's expectation is, and what seems potentially plausible, is that as we go forward, precisely because the labour market's tight, it's difficult to fill those vacancies. Firms might hang on to workers a bit longer than they otherwise would, and so when that would give a bit of a flavour of the 2008 recession, where we saw pretty big falls in pay, but unemployment rose not as much as certainly in recessions previously. And so if the Bank of England's forecast to be believed, unemployment hits about 6%, which is higher than it is now. It's currently below 4%, but it's not sort of by historical terms especially high. Instead, all the pain comes through lower pay rather than lower numbers.
So, when the Bank of England are calling for pay restraint, do you think that's that's something that we should stand by, or should employers be offering real terms wage rise now? And is that going to add to inflation? Is that going to be a direct inflationary measure? I don't know whether we want to pick that up.
That's obviously a controversial topic. I mean, workers should be asking for pay rises because they should be protecting trying to protect their incomes, and we shouldn't be judging that. And firms should be trying to balance those pressures with the other pressures on their business, their rising energy bills, and that's going to play out. And I kind of think it's, if I was sitting in the Bank of England or in the Treasury, I think it's time to kind of, it's not about you saying exactly what you think should happen, because these things are going to be determined it doesn't really matter what the governor of the Bank of England says. Profits are going to be coming down, wages are going to be coming down in real terms, everybody's poorer, and just being honest about that and adult about that, and recognising that industrial action is just what happens when that world is playing out, is what an adult approach to the next few years looks like.
Yeah, and just to add to that, really, that cutting pay in real terms is not what the economy needs when we are on the brink of a potential recession that could cost 1 million jobs. And there is no evidence whatsoever of an inflation pay spiral. What we're seeing, as has been said by a number of witnesses today, is that we're seeing significant real terms drops in the value of wages at the moment, and that is reducing customer spending power.
Tom, do you want to add anything?
I don't mean to add
that. Can I move you on to, have you got any handle on which type of workers are receiving the most substantial wage increases, and who's suffering the most, and how is that going to affect pay inequality? I just add to the issue of unemployment rates whilst I'm at it. You mentioned rates of 4% going to 6%. Of course, in many parts of the country, it's significantly higher than that. I don't know what that tells us. In my own constituents, 8%, as it's double, and it consistently stays at double the rate. But if I could return to the original question about which type of workers are receiving the most substantial wages, and does that tell us anything? Anybody?
Yeah, I mean, since October, we've seen. It's not a great picture for anyone. I think. Well, I'm sure it's a great picture for some individuals, but on the whole, you don't see sort of very large pay increases at any part of the distribution. So the top 1% have since October managed to kind of roughly hold steady in real terms, whereas those who are a bit further down, those who are in the middle, or those at the bottom of the pay distribution have seen real terms cut. So it does look like so far the picture has been one of increasing earnings inequality. I think it's worth keeping that in mind alongside the package that the government has announced with means-tested grants, so 650 quid to anyone on universal credit, and then additional grants to those who have disabilities or are pensioners. To some extent, that's going to kind of go in the opposite direction, because the grants are targeted towards poorer households.
So, just to finish, looking at these cycles, it's pretty hard to understand how long the Ukrainian crisis is going to go on, and so on and so forth. But looking at history, how long would it take us to get back to real terms growth? What's the sort of lifespan of this crisis? Anybody got any thoughts on that?
The obvious answer is who knows? Because a lot of this is being driven by energy bills. And we can tell you what, if the Bank of England's current forecasts play out, then it means that we will be, next year, because of these falls in real pay, we'll be back to the pay levels we had in 2003. So we've lost 20 years worth of pay growth. We didn't have much pay growth during that period, but it's still so large that it takes us all the way back to 2003. Household incomes will be lower by the middle of this decade than they were during the pandemic. So we're talking about it taking us, because the fall is so large, and because the productivity projections of both the Bank of England and the Office for Budget Responsibility are now so weak because of Britain's relative decline over the course of the last 15 years in terms of our growth rates, that not only is the fall to our incomes huge, but the recovery from them is weak, and the combination of the two means we don't get back to 2021 income levels until the middle of this decade. So, on those numbers, it's very grim. Now, we should say there is just huge uncertainty. So, if markets decide that they see Europe getting through this winter better than they expected, able to deal with combinations of gas rationing and gas shortages, without totally catastrophic results, then and they've been through that once, so they've rather than just huge uncertainty, there's like, okay, that's what happens when this happens. It's possible we see falls in wholesale prices. On the flip side, what we've learned over the last year is that every time Europe makes some progress in either providing gas from other sources or others, then Putin turns down what's coming in from Russia to make sure that doesn't make a material improvement in our situation. So I think we are very much in the hands of that. But that is, countries have been through, we've had experiences before of geopolitically led economic traumas, okay, normally in wars, but not just in wars. And in general, the important things for countries that get through that well is that they understand that they've got to get through it together and that it requires policy making that is different to normal times. We are going to be moving into a world, and I know a lot of people, 5 months ago wanted to say anything that gets in the way of the price mechanism in the energy market is a complete nightmare. Well, I'm afraid waking up to the fact that Putin's controlling the prices is about time. We're going to be controlling bits of these prices. We can do it slowly, okay, and wait for things to get much worse, or we can announce it on Thursday that we're going to be capping elements of wholesale and retail prices, and that we need to be intervening in bits of the generation pricing, parts of the generation business, because those prices we can't allow to fall into windfalls. There's going to be we need solidarity across the population, and we're going to have to move to bits of policy intervention that all of us thought would never be needed.
Okay, I've got about 20 minutes and 4 questions, so if we can keep each question to a maximum of 5 minutes, that'd be great. Tony Antoniozzi, please.
Thanks, Chair. I've got 2 questions for you, Torsten. Does unemployment have to rise significantly to bring inflation under control, as the Bank of England assumes? And if so, which workers are most at risk?
That's a big question. So I think for the government, for policymakers, it doesn't matter what I think. It doesn't actually really matter what you think, because it's what the Bank of England thinks, because you've chosen to make the Bank of England independent and to give it this remit. And so what matters is if they think that significant rise in unemployment is needed to bring inflation. And remember, by inflation we mean domestically generated inflation within the labour market. We don't mean this energy-driven inflation, okay? They're not trying to deal with that, except insofar as it leads to expectations amongst workers for higher wages, okay? They're trying to deal with domestically generated inflation from a tight labour market. Their judgment is that we do need to see high-ish unemployment compared to what we've been used to in the recent past, 6%. I think they wouldn't say that's a point estimate. There's a lot of uncertainty here, and we haven't been through a situation like this before, but they're taking the judgment that is. And so I think you've got to assume that judgment isn't going to change because the personnel aren't going to change in the short term. And that means if you do significant policy measures which support demand, for example, in the economy now, you should expect higher interest rates in response to those things. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't do them, but it means you should be really clear about what the job is of fiscal policy during that kind of crisis, which is to worry a lot about the distribution, and you would be prepared to accept slightly higher interest rates, higher than they would otherwise have been, okay? I don't mean necessarily higher, but higher than they would otherwise have been, in exchange for being able to use fiscal policy to change the distribution outcomes from this crisis. And it also means, obviously, not doing things that you don't. But is that judgment they're making reasonable? It's reasonable. It's a reasonable judgment. It's the same judgment being made by the Fed. Is it definitely right? No, there's absolutely huge uncertainty. None of us have watched a crisis like this play out in a UK labour market that's like it is. We've never had a price shock in a tight labour market in a flexible labour market, which the UK now has. So we don't actually know how this plays out. So anyone that's very confident, I think, needs to step back and say we don't know. But it's not an unreasonable judgment.
So we don't know then if we can, can the UK's tight labour market prevent unemployment reaching the levels of previous downturns?
Well, they're not projecting it reaching. We should be. They're not projecting the kinds of things we saw in the 1980s recessions of very widespread unemployment, and then that turned into widespread falling labour market participation in the years afterwards, which is partly what explains some of the higher unemployment in parts of the country even today. In terms of who generally suffers from rising unemployment, the answer in generally is younger workers tend to see their unemployment rate rise faster. Obviously, we can't really use the pandemic as a good guide because it was so sectorally concentrated, so I wouldn't expect to see exactly the same pattern of unemployment because we were shutting down some specific sectors and paying people to stay employed in other sectors, but generally we would expect to see it happening in some of the lower paying parts of the economy, partly because those parts of the economy are ones where some of this discretionary spending may be pulled back quickest. We've talked about hospitality, some bits of retail, retail overall, but hospitality in particular. But it's also those parts of the economy where firms maybe less keen to hold on to workers, whereas if someone's got more expensive trained staff, they may be prepared to suck up taking losses that year to keep the staff going through that. So I think overall you should worry about younger workers and you should worry about low earners.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Alan Brown, please.
Thanks. The IMF looked at how the cost of energy increases in terms of household spending across 25 countries, and what they showed was that in the UK, the amount of household spending for the poorest rose at twice the rate of that of the wealthiest, therefore effectively increasing inequality and obviously a bigger burden on the poorest in terms of trying to heat their homes. They also showed that other countries such as France, Sweden, Finland had almost negligible divergence in terms of these household pressures. Torsten, do you agree with that analogy? And if so, what lessons can the UK learn from these other countries then?
So I've seen the chart you're talking about from the IMF and their report. I don't know the underlying analysis, so I don't want to judge whether it's right or wrong, but I'd make a number of reflections. One is an energy-driven shock is much worse for lower-income households. It's partly for the reason Tom was raising earlier, which is a larger part of their consumption basket is energy, and that's why you get higher inflation rates for poor households when that's the nature of the crisis, even though higher-income households tend to spend more on petrol, for example. But petrol prices have fallen back a bit as oil's done better than gas. So I think that way of thinking about it massively underplays how much worse it is for poor households, because it's not just that they face higher inflation, it's that the margins for adjustment, the ways in which higher income households deal with those shocks aren't available to lower income households. So they don't have the savings to draw down on. They're less likely to be able to go to friends and family, which is how lower income households tend to cope with lots of shocks, because everybody's being hit at the same time this time. They haven't built up the savings during the crisis we've just seen. They don't have the same levels of luxury spending that can be cut back to then pay these energy. I think it's really important. Like, a crisis where everybody has to find, say, £1,000 a year more is fine if you just spend £1,000 less on your £10,000 holiday. Okay, it might be not what you want, but it's fine. It's not when you haven't got any non-essential spending to cut back on.
On that, then, so the key question is there lessons you can learn from packages or measures that other countries have put in place that the UK government hasn't?
So one thing I would be careful about is I see a lot of people commenting on different inflation rates in different European countries. So forget outside Europe, because there's a different world happening outside Europe. But within Europe, people say, oh, look, France has got much lower inflation rate than we have. Is that because it's all fine in France? I think it's really important to understand that the choice of policy instrument you use to try and tackle this crisis, even if you spend the same amount of money, really does affect the measured inflation rate, even though it doesn't affect the actual level of the problem. So in France, what they've chosen to do is to cap retail prices, which is why they're seeing lower levels of measured inflation, but the scale of the actual problem is the same, more or less. And so the inflation gap isn't. I would not take too much hope that the French shows you a way through. Instead, what they've done so far, and they're now backing away from slightly because the costs are starting to mount. But what they've done is to say we're going to cap the costs because we've got a nationalised energy generator. We're going to take a load of those costs onto their balance sheet, so the taxpayer's still paying just via crushing the value of a nationalised company. Whereas we've chosen to give incomes to households as a way of dealing with it, which lets inflation come through on the measured. In the end, if you want to focus on one measure, the thing we should care about is what is happening to real incomes. Because there we care about the money that's being given to people and their wages, the stuff Andy McDonald was just asking us about, and what's happening to the prices they're paying. It's the two together that we need to care about when we think about getting through this winter. Don't just look at inflation and just look at nominal incomes. I think then what the IMF chart really tells you isn't really about this crisis. What it tells you is that in Britain we have ended up with a really toxic combination of low growth and high inequality. And if you have that toxic combination and they last, then what you end up with is a disaster for lower middle income Britain, and that is the world we're living in. And I think it is time everybody wakes up. I think we're kind of comparably, as prosperous as countries like Australia, Canada, the Netherlands, Germany. We are not. We are a very, very long way away. And that's because of this combination. Because the only people in Britain that have similar income levels to the people in those countries are the rich. Because our high inequality makes up for the fact that we overall have a lower level of GDP per capita. But the result of that is, I'll give you one fact, and then I will shut up, I promise. But take those 5 countries, okay? If we had their level of GDP per capita, so at mean incomes, okay, and their level of inequality, then the typical household in Britain would be £8,800 better off. It's not £500, okay? It's £8,800. And when you take a country that's had that high inequality for that long and had a relative economic decline for 15 years, what you get is a disaster for middle-income Britain. And then you add on an energy price shock and you're in trouble.
Move on, because I don't have much time. Moriarty, what do you want to see from the government announced this week, and how should it be funded?
So I think there's a number of really important things that we need to see in terms of support. One is scale, which is now being talked about a lot. This is the level that the energy price gap is due to go up to in October, and the even higher figures being projected for January means that this is a crisis on a large scale, and there needs to be support on a large scale. It needs not to be buy now, pay later. The kinds of numbers that we're seeing, if you envisage them being loaded back onto bills, particularly bills of people on low incomes, that's not going to be feasible. I think the important thing that we're seeing is there is going to need to be targeted support for low income families on top of whatever is done universally, because, as I was saying earlier, we are already seeing very large numbers of people struggling in the summer with the current rate of payment. And the other thing we are going to see is that there will be higher levels of debt, and it's very important that there is the right protections in place for individuals who get into debt. In particular, it is open to energy companies to move people onto prepayment meters if they run up debt. We know that people on prepayment meters are much more likely to find that they can't top up their prepayment meter, so they run out of gas and electricity. That is a huge problem. That's exactly what leads to people being in these really difficult circumstances. So we need to see a winter ban on people being pushed onto prepayment meters. We need really good support from the energy companies in terms of proactively identifying people who need support, making sure that support is there. We are going to need targeted support for people on low incomes, as well as whatever is done on a large scale, which really should be paid for through taxation, because it falls more fairly than loading it back onto people's bills.
You spoke about paying through taxation. So what do you think the proposal starts to cut taxes, which the incoming Prime Minister said would be a priority? Is that not at odds of how we're going to support this?
I mean, there are obviously choices to be made by the new Prime Minister and the new government about cutting taxes. I think from where I sit, what we are really concerned about is people who are finding themselves in acute financial difficulty, not able to keep the lights on, not able to keep food on the table, and we need to see support that really responds to the situation that those people are in right now, as well as the amount that it could get worse in October.
Thanks. Can I ask, the incoming Prime Minister spoke about scrapping the Green Levy. What does that mean in reality in terms of bills, and what is the Green Levy?
Yeah, so there isn't one tax called the Green Levy, so there's a number of levies on household bills. For time reasons, I won't go through all of them. It's quite a complicated policy area, but essentially there's some parts of your bill that you pay which goes some way towards subsidising renewable energy. Now, as things stand, the cumulative effect of all of those things will add about £11 to bills over the coming winter, and that's because one of the levies, because of the particular way in which it works, has actually flipped to actually subsidising household energy bills rather than taxing it. So, I mean, to be fair to the incoming Prime Minister, you might not want to scrap that one, but even so, you'd only be talking about a £50 or so cut over the coming winter. So might be perfectly good reasons why you want to do that, but we are talking about pretty small numbers compared to the scale of the problem.
Compared to a £1,600 price cap increase, that levy is negligible.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Yeah.
Thank you. And lastly, for 5 minutes, Paul Howell, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to come back to yourself, Moriarty, just with regard to Ofgem in particular, but I'm going to then come back onto the prepayment meters and all of that sort of agenda. But do you think that Ofgem is striking the right balance between protecting the financial resilience of the market and protecting vulnerable customers?
So we are really keen to see Ofgem absolutely put customers at the heart of what they're doing. I mean, they clearly have to look across the whole piece, and at the moment there are consequences for consumers if energy suppliers fail, and we've seen that, because one of the many components of people's bills at the moment is paying for the costs of the energy suppliers who failed last year. But we are really keen for Ofgem to be thinking about consumers, making sure that energy companies are respecting their obligations. Energy companies have an obligation to support customers in financial difficulty, and that is not as well observed as it needs to be at the moment. And Ofgem is in a position to make sure that is enforced. So we're really keen to see them do as much as possible of that. Okay,
and obviously on that same sort of line, do you think that suppliers have been as active or as resilient as possibly as they should be in terms of offering better debt repayment options, or not?
So we think the picture is quite patchy, is what we hear. I think there are many energy suppliers, but we don't think that all energy suppliers are doing as much as they could to make sure that customers are looked after properly, and we're calling on them and on Ofgem as the regulator to make sure that they are doing that in the most proactive way possible.
Okay, and just coming back to the whole conversation about prepayment meters, do you, I think you've already stated that you're concerned about the push to put people onto prepayment meters and needing to take that pressure off as far as possible, making it more just that they should avoid putting people onto prepayment meters as much as possible. Can I just ask you to confirm that, but also do you think that there's anything should change with the way that the whole prepayment meter system works in terms of the pricing balance that people suffer when they're on a prepayment meter?
So, to take those two parts, people on prepayment meters pay more for their energy than people who are paying in other means. And as Torsten was saying earlier, a higher proportion of people on low incomes are on prepayment meters. So it just feels intrinsically wrong that the people who are least able to pay are actually paying most for their energy. So that is certainly something that we feel needs to be looked at. I mean, prepayment meters, some people choose to have prepayment meters. They work for some people, but they do have, they are, if you are paying through direct debit or in arrears, then you're not going to be disconnected. But we are seeing increasing numbers, as over 13,000 people who have come to us because they simply can't top up their prepayment meters, and if you can't top up a prepayment meter, it just runs out, and then you don't have access to energy, and that is, at the scale that we're looking at, that is an untenable situation to be in over the summer, and particularly the prospect of potentially large numbers of people who run up. It's a relatively small level of debt where it can be that this can be brought in. There are, if anybody is in the circumstance where their energy supplier is proposing to put them on a prepayment meter, there are, they can put forward the case why that shouldn't be so. But where people are being moved, that is really problematic, and we're saying there should be a winter ban on moving people to prepayment meters.
Thank you for that. I think I could go along with the table, but I think we're tight on time, Chair.
We are. So thank you to Dame Clare Moriarty, Joanne Cairns, Torsten Bell and Tom Waters for your contributions this morning. We're grateful for you coming.